This is part 3 of the video series Sunni Islamic Jurisprudence. So, the Shafi fiqh on jihad. And as I said in my last video, towards the end, that things do get a little spicy here, and you'll see what I mean by that. Um, in Ahmad al-Dawudi's The Islamic Law of War, Justifications and Regulations on page 81, we find that Imam Shafi was of the view, and I quote, that Muslims are to wage war against unbelievers if they refuse to accept Islam or submit to Muslim rule, unquote. Bullet point number 2, the author in the same book on the same page further in describing Imam Shafi's views goes on to say the following, and I quote, Al-Shafi here bases his opinion on the theory that the Quranic texts, chapter 9 verse 5 and chapter 9 verse 29, abrogated all the other texts, and the hadith narrated by Abu Huraira. However, he differentiates between Arab and non-Arab idolaters. Arab idolaters are to be fought if they do not accept Islam, while non-Arab idolaters and the people of the book are to accept Islam or pay jizya. Otherwise, Muslims are to fight them. Since al-Shafi maintains that it was unbelief, not aggression, that was the casus belli in these texts, he permits fighting some categories of non-combatants, such as the peasants, the crippled, and the aged until they become Muslims or pay jizya. Although he does not include women and children, however, he adds that Muslims are to cease fighting in cases of necessity, for example, when they are weak. According to this position, therefore, jihad is not only a defensive war, but also an offensive one against non-Muslims. And Khadouri points out here that it was Shafi who first formulated the doctrine that the jihad had for its intent the waging of war on unbelievers for their disbelief, and not merely when they entered into conflict with Islam. Unquote. However, on page 76 of War and Peace in Islam, the uses and abuses of jihad, edited by HRH, Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad, Professor Ibrahim Khalin, and Professor Muhammad Hashim Kamali, we read the following, and I quote, in fact, among the 4 Sunni schools of jurisprudence, only one, the Shafi school, contains that the view that a person's belief can be a reason for fighting against them. This view, however, is mitigated by the fact that an opposite view in agreement with the majority is also attributed to Shafi, unquote. So, the Shafi school is the only one, but it's mitigated by by the fact that the opposite view is also in agreement with the majority. Okay, yeah. So this would also mean that Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal's school uh, also is of the view, like the Maliki and Hanafi school, that jihad is only permissible in self-defense. Uh, with the Shafi school being the only controversial school on the topic, if there is any school that is controversial on the topic. But I mean, again, as I read earlier, from War and Peace in Islam, the uses and abuses of jihad, the people behind this work, claim that there is a opposite view that mitigates Imam Shafi's offensive jihad warfare view. Going on to the last bullet point, in an article titled Jihad is Not Perpetual Warfare by Imam Zaid Shakir, Imam Shafi viewed a land populated by unbelievers who are not at war with the Muslims as not constituting Darul Harb. Um, I will now get into Professor Asma Afsaruddin's views of jihad throughout history. Anyways, by the early Abbasid period, roughly mid-late 2nd, 8th century, the military aspect of jihad would receive greater emphasis in many circles, and in the opinion of some jurists, was understood to override the other spiritual and non-militant significations of this term. The jurist al-Shafi is said to have been the first to permit jihad to be launched against non-Muslims as offensive warfare, although he qualified the non-Muslims as referring only to pagan Arabs and not to non-Arab non-Muslims. He further divided the world into Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, referring to non-Muslim territories, while recognizing a third possibility, Dar al-Ad, the abode of treaty, or Dar al-Sulh, the abode of reconciliation, referring to non-Islamic states that may enter into a peace treaty with the Islamic State by rendering an annual tribute. Al-Shafi's perspectives on jihad were in many ways a marked departure from earlier juristic thinking and reflects a further development of the Syrian school of thought on this issue. This is quite evident when his views are compared with those of jurists from the earlier Hanafi school of law, eponymously founded by Abu Hanifa. Hanafi jurists, for example, did not subscribe to a third abode of treaty as devised by al-Shafi, but were of the opinion that the inhabitants of a territory which had controlled a truce with the Muslims and paid a tribute to the latter became part of the abode of Islam and entitled to the protection of the Islamic government. The Hanafis also adhered to the position that non-believers could only be fought if they resorted to armed conflict and not simply on account of their disbelief. This remained a principle of contention between later Shafi and Hanafi jurists. In juridical and administrative literature, jihad essentially became reduced to qital, or fighting, by roughly the 9th century, and the term is used exclusively in this sense. However, many non-juridical sources, such as hadith and ethical works, continue to preserve for us a much broader spectrum of meanings assigned to the term jihad and the multiple religio-social commitments and duties signified by it. It is worth emphasizing that the concepts of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb have no basis in the Quran nor in the Sunnah. The invention of these terms and the resulting aggrandizement of the military aspect of jihad were based rather on ad hoc juristic interpretations of particularly verses in chapter 9 verse 5 and chapter 9 verse 29, largely in deference to realpolitik in the Abbasid period. These legal postulations are therefore not doctrinally binding in any way, and in fact, by the 4th century of Islam, 10th century of the CE, these terms began to fall into disuse because they no longer accurately described contemporary historical and political reality. Accordingly, juristic thinking in this period, in accommodation of these changed realities, came to regard the caliph's duty of waging jihad as theorized by an earlier generation to have essentially lapsed. Over time, the term Dar al-Islam also underwent significant changes so that by the 12th century, some jurists were of the opinion that non-Muslim territory in which Muslims were free to practice their religion could be subsumed under the rubric of Dar al-Islam. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Reform-minded scholars such as Muhammad Abdu and later his student Rashid Rida would recognize that the bipolar division of the world had been defunct for a while, and explicitly affirmed that peaceful coexistence was the normal state of affairs between the Islamic and non-Islamic worlds. Mahmoud Shaltut, who like Abdu became the rector of Al-Azhar University, was of the opinion that not only defensive wars are permissible in was of the opinion that only defensive wars are permissible in response to external aggression. The terms Darul Islam and Darul Harb and the concept of an offensive jihad have been revived, however, in the contemporary period by religious militants to justify their political goals, predicated on an assumed basic incompatibility between the Western and Islamic worlds. Imam Shafi versus the majority of classical Islamic jurists on jihad. Again, quoting from Ahmad al-Dawudi's The Islamic Law of War, Justifications and Regulations, pages 81 to 82, and I quote, the majority of classical jurists based their position on the interpretation of Quranic texts on war, that in Islam peace is intended to be the normal and permanent state of relation with the non-Muslims. They advocate that according to the Quran, chapter 49 verse 13 and chapter 60 verse 8, Muslim relations toward non-Muslims are based on cooperation, justice, and rapprochement. Unlike the classical jurists who formulated their theory in a time when a state of war already existed in the absence of a specific peace treaty, modern scholars advocate their position in a post-United Nations UN world. Concluding statements, okay. If one is going to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah correctly according to Orthodox Sunni Islam in regards to matters such as jihad, one has to do it in light of the prominent four schools of Islamic jurisprudence. It is also mandatory for a Muslim to do taqlid shakhsi of one of the four imams according to the view of Orthodox Sunni Islam. According to Orthodox Sunni Islam, each of the four schools provide equally legitimate and valid interpretations of Islamic law. Each of them have a central role in Orthodox Sunni Islam. Though Orthodox Sunni Islam gives Imam Shafi a central role along with the other three prominent Sunni jurists of Islam, Orthodox Sunni Islam also teaches that if most Islamic scholars come to a consensus upon an issue, it is religiously binding upon Muslims, while the minority view among scholars is discarded. Does such a religiously binding consensus on the debatable topic of jihad exist? And if so, what is it? Yes, there is a religiously binding consensus to which all schools of Islamic jurisprudence must adhere to, which is that warfare against non-Muslims is only allowed in case of self-defense. Hence, therefore, if one looks at the verses pertaining to jihad in the Quran and hadiths touching upon the topic of warfare in one way or another, while not bypassing centuries of Islamic scholarship, then one would have to conclude that the overall traditional faith of Sunni Muslims does not allow warfare unless if it is defensive. In fact, I shouldn't say overall. I mean, let me just throw the word overall. I mean, one would have to conclude that traditional faith of Sunni Muslims does not allow warfare unless if it is defensive. Imam Shafi's views of offensive jihad is the minority view. Yes, all four schools have a central role in Islamic jurisprudence, But if a consensus is reached in favor of one view as compared to all other views, then it is incumbent of Muslims of all these four schools to stick to that view. I hope this provides further clarification. Um, and if there's anything that I said that was not clear, if there's any criticism you have of any of my 3 parts of this video series, please do let me know. Do share me your comments, whether it's negative or positive regarding this video series. I'm willing to get as much feedback as I can, criticism as well as compliments are both welcome. I hope you enjoyed watching all 3 parts, and you have a good rest of the week.